When Maurice Carver's SUV blew a tire on the dark stretch of Route 9 at 1:45 in the morning, the only lit building for 11 miles was a half-dead service plaza called Delmer's, and the only person inside it was a man mopping a floor that was already clean. Maurice limped the truck into the gravel lot on the rim and walked in under a buzzing sign with 3 letters burned out. He had on a gray hoodie and old jeans, no watch, no driver, no entourage idling outside. 3 championship rings in a safe 200 miles away. A net worth that didn't fit on one line. And a face that, at 2 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere, registered only as a big tired man who needed coffee and a phone signal. The man with the mop looked up. Late 40s, maybe 50. Big hands. A quiet, careful way of moving, like a man who'd learned not to take up more room than he'd been given. "Coffee's fresh," the man said. "Sit anywhere. Phone reception's better by the window." Before Maurice could answer, a door banged open in the back and a heavy-set man in a stained polo came out already talking. "Mercer, that trucker in Bay 4 said the bathroom's filthy. You've been leaning on that mop for an hour. I'm docking you the half hour, and don't give me the face." The man with the mop, Mercer, did not give him any face at all. He just said, "Yes, Mr. Delmer," and turned toward the back, and his shoulders did the thing shoulders do when they've been doing that exact thing for years. And Maurice Carver sat down by the window and said absolutely nothing. He poured his own coffee and let his eyes move, the way they always did when a room had a story it hadn't told him yet. The first thing he saw was the man called Mercer slide a wrapped sandwich across the counter to a kid in an army surplus jacket who was counting change out of his palm and coming up short. Mercer waved the change away. Did it without looking up? The way you do a thing you don't want credit for. The second thing was Mercer's hands. When he set down the coffee pot, he pressed his thumb against a callus on his palm, a specific small gesture, and something cold and electric went down Maurice's spine, because that was his gesture. The one his mother used to smack his hand for. The one he still did in the fourth quarter of close games. The third thing was a photograph taped to the side of the register, curled in yellow. A man on a porch, squinting into an old sun, a cigarette in his teeth. Maurice's mother had kept exactly 1 photograph of his father in a drawer his whole childhood, and he had memorized that squint, and he was looking at the same man. The fourth thing was the owner's voice again, from the back. "Mercer, I swear, Mercer." The name landed in Maurice's chest like a dropped glass. Because the name his mother never said out loud, the name that was missing from his own, the name of the man who left before Maurice could walk, was Otis Mercer. The fifth thing was a worn 3-ring binder behind the counter, the kind kids keep. Its spine furry from handling, a strip of masking tape on the front, with no words he could read from where he sat. Maurice noticed every one of them. He did not react. He wrapped both hands around the coffee and held very still. Now here is the part that nobody in that service plaza understood yet. The big tired man by the window had spent his whole life as the son of a father who left. 1 photograph in a drawer, a name his mother wouldn't speak, a hole shaped like a man that no amount of money or championships had ever filled. He had a younger brother once, a little one named Isaiah, and he had lost him young. And after that, Maurice had moved through the world feeling, underneath everything, like the last of a family that had mostly already happened to him. He did not know, sitting there with his flat tire and his coffee, that the man mopping the floor for $4 an hour shared his blood. He did not know that this man had known him for years, and he did not know the reason, the real devastating reason, that a man this kind, this capable, was buried on the graveyard shift of a dying truck stop, letting a small, frightened owner dock him a half hour at a time. What Maurice Carver had no idea about was one single fact. And when he finally understood it, the calmest man in any room was going to be unable to say a word. So stay with us for the whole video. Because the brother he'd been missing his entire life was standing 11 feet away with a mop. And the secret that man was carrying is going to break you in half. Maurice Carver grew up in Eaton Springs, raised by a small, iron-spined woman named Della, who cleaned other people's houses and never once let her son apologize for being big or hungry or fatherless. His father, Otis Mercer, left before Maurice could form a memory of his face. He was, by every account Della would reluctantly give, a charming, restless, weak man, the kind who arrives like weather and leaves the same way. He had been somewhere else before Della, and there had been someone else, and a child Maurice never heard a single word about, because Della only knew the part of the story that happened to her. Otis came and stayed 2 years and gave Della a son, and left like he'd left the one before. Della never spoke his name. She kept one photograph in a drawer wrapped in a handkerchief, and when Maurice asked once why she kept it at all, she said the only thing she ever said about the man: "Nobody chooses where they come from, baby. You only get to choose who you carry." Maurice carried his mother. He carried Isaiah's memory. He did not carry Otis Mercer because you cannot carry a man who was never there. He became everything anyway. 3 championships. An empire built brick by careful brick. A reputation for a stillness that men 20 years older envied. And underneath it, every single day, a quiet ache for the family the man with the cigarette had scattered and walked away from. A wondering, never spoken, about whether there was anyone else out there with his blood in them, sitting in some town wondering the same thing back. There was. His name was Curtis Mercer. He was 5 years older than Maurice, and he had spent his life carrying the one thing Maurice never could. Roy Delmer had not always been the kind of man who docked a half hour from a man making $4 an hour. He was 56, and he had inherited the plaza from his own father back when Route 9 was the only road north and the lot was full every night. Then the interstate came through 11 miles west, and the trucks went with it. And Roy had spent 20 years watching the only thing his family ever owned die one empty bay at a time. He owed the fuel distributor. He owed the bank. He owed his ex-wife. He paid Curtis cash, under the table, $4 an hour, and he told himself a story about how he was helping a man nobody else would hire. And somewhere under that story, he knew it was the other way around, that Curtis was the only thing keeping the place breathing, and that knowing it was exactly why he had to make the man small. Fear does that to a certain kind of man. It looks for the one person beneath him and stands on them to feel taller. He had gone to bed the night before doing the math the way drowning men do. The column of what he owed against the column of what came in. The number worse every time. He woke up mean because he woke up scared. He was not a monster. He was a frightened man, squeezing the one person who couldn't leave. And in about an hour, he was going to find out exactly who had been mopping his floors. It was almost 3 when the young waitress came back from her break. Danny, 20 years old, working nights to save for community college. The only other soul on the graveyard shift. She'd covered Curtis's bathroom while he was out front, the way she always did. The way the two of them had quietly kept each other alive on that shift for a year. In a booth in the corner, an old long-haul trucker named Earl, 63, who'd eaten at Delmer's since before the interstate, lowered his newspaper and watched everything over his glasses without a word. And Maurice, his tire patched by a tow service that wouldn't arrive until dawn, made a choice. He didn't have to make. He walked up to the counter and he nodded at the curled photograph taped to the register. And he kept his voice easy. "That your dad?" Curtis glanced at it. Something guarded came down over his face. "Yeah, Otis," Maurice said. Not a question. Curtis went very still. The mop stopped. "How would you know his name?" "Because it's mine too," Maurice said quietly. "It's the name that's missing off the front of me." Otis Mercer left a woman named Della Carver in Eaton Springs 40-some years ago. She had his son. He pressed his thumb against the callus on his own palm, the gesture, and watched Curtis's eyes drop to it and widen. "That son is me." And before you find out what Curtis Mercer said next, before this man who'd carried a secret for years finally has to set it down on a truck stop counter at 3 in the morning, you need to understand that Maurice Carver, who had stayed composed through arenas and cameras and the deaths of everyone he loved, was about to come apart over a brother he'd never met. Nobody moved. Danny froze with the coffee pot in her hand. Earl set down his paper. Nobody spoke. The whole place held its breath. Curtis Mercer reached under the counter and took out the worn binder. He set it on the counter between them and opened it with hands that had started, very slightly, to shake. It was a scrapbook. 20 years of it. Newspaper clippings gone soft at the folds. Box scores, a magazine cover, a grainy printout of a championship night. Every page of it about Maurice. "I've known since you were a rookie," Curtis said. His voice was rough and low. "Daddy told me at the end of a bottle one night that he had another boy in Eaton Springs with a woman named Della. Carver kid. Then I saw your name in the paper, and I did the math, and I just knew." He turned a page gently. "I followed every game, every one. I had a whole brother out there being something, and I never said a word." "Why?" Maurice said. And the word barely made it out. That was the convergence the whole room had been standing inside without knowing it. The kind man on the graveyard shift, the $4 an hour, the binder, the reason none of it had ever made sense. It was all one thing. It had always been one thing. "Because somebody had to take him in," Curtis said. "Daddy, our daddy. He came back to me about 9 years ago, sick, broke, nobody left who'd have him. He did me as dirty as he did you, Maurice. Left me and my mama when I was 6, never sent a dime. By rights, I owed that man nothing. Masamamwoots." Curtis's jaw worked. "But he showed up at my door dying and there wasn't anybody else. So I took the night job because it let me be home with him in the days. $4 an hour because Delmer pays cash. And the bills from the man are more than you'd believe." He pressed his own thumb to his own callus without noticing, the exact same gesture. "I never called you because how do you call a brother you've never met and say, 'Your deadbeat father is dying in my back bedroom, and I love him anyway, and I can't afford his medicine'? I didn't want to drag you into a debt that was never yours. I figured you'd had enough taken from you already." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. And he said the thing that the whole room would remember for the rest of their lives. "He wasn't a good father, Maurice. I just didn't want him to die alone." And Maurice Carver, for the first time in his adult life, could not speak. When he found his voice, here is what he did. He did not rage about the $4 an hour, or the 20 silent years, or the man in the back bedroom who'd left them both. He came around the counter, and he put his arms around the brother he'd had for 50 years and met 4 minutes ago, and the two enormous men stood there in the fluorescent light, holding on like the floor might give way. Then he turned to Roy Delmer, who had crept out from the back and gone gray in the face. Maurice did not crush him. "You've been standing on the best man in 3 counties because you're scared of losing this place," he said. "I know that fear. I'm going to make you a deal you don't deserve. The back wages get paid tonight, in full, legal. You restructure with people I'll send, and you pay a real wage going forward. And if you ever dock a man a half hour again, I'll hear about it. Take the second chance. Most people don't get one. He covered every dollar of their father's medical debt before the sun came up. He paid Danny's tuition on the spot because she'd been sharing her tips with his brother for a year without knowing whose brother he was. Earl the trucker, who'd watched it all, folded his newspaper and said the one thing he'd been holding. 40 years I've eaten in this dump. First decent thing I ever saw happen here. His mother had told him, nobody chooses where they come from. You only get to choose who you carry. Curtis had carried the man who didn't deserve it. Now Maurice was going to carry Curtis. And before the tow truck came, the two brothers got in Maurice's patched-up SUV and drove the back way to a small house where an old man with a familiar squint was dying, so that Maurice could decide, for himself, who he was going to carry too. So look at what one blown tire on Route 9 uncovered. A frightened owner who got handed a second chance instead of a lawsuit. A 20-year-old waitress who shared her tips with a stranger and got her whole future paid forward. A trucker who got to see one good thing in a place he'd watched die. A man who spent 9 years quietly carrying the father who abandoned him alone on $4 an hour, asking no one for anything. And a man worth more than that whole highway who walked in for coffee and walked out with the family his father had scattered before he was born. His mother said it best, and she said it about the hardest man either of her sons ever knew. You only get to choose who you carry. Curtis chose, Maurice chose, and so will you. If you've ever carried somebody who didn't earn it, just because somebody had to, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button, because it helps stories about quiet, unglamorous love reach the people who need them. And if you believe family is who shows up, subscribe and join this community. There are more of us than you'd ever guess, and not one of us is alone. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. We will see you there.